Hello, listener. This is The Way In, a podcast about finding our way through the often impenetrable worlds of psychotherapy, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis. I'm your host, Tyson Connor. I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist and clinical supervisor in Washington State. Each episode of this show, I talk with other mental health professionals about the work they do and topics they care about, using language that you don't need an advanced degree to understand. Come join us as we try to find the way in. And today, our guide on the podcast is Dr. Daniel Benveniste. Dr. Benveniste is a clinical psychologist in Sammamish, Washington, a visiting professor of clinical psychology in Wuhan, China, an honorary member of the American Psychoanalytic Association, and the author of Libido, Culture, and Consciousness, Revisiting Freud's Totem and Taboo, and also The Interwoven Lives of Sigmund, Anna, and W. Ernst Freud, 3 Generations of Psychoanalysis. Daniel, thank you for coming on to the show today.
Thank you, Tyson. It's good to be here.
And our topic for today's episode is the theory and work of Sigmund Freud. So, big topic, complicated topic. On the show, we talk about how all theory is in some way or other autobiographical. I imagine that'll come up later as we're talking about our topic. But for you in particular, what brought you to Freud, and how did you come to be a bit of a Freud scholar?
Well, I think like many people in our field, as a child, as an adolescent, I was a people watcher. And I was sort of naturally self-reflective. And so my dreams and anxieties or depressive states might have been something that I would wonder about, I'd be curious about. I never really ran away from them. I was more curious about what was going on. And I was working at a summer camp, and I just sort of had a natural feel for the children and did well there, but then got sick. I had a bad flu. And during that time, for some reason, I can't exactly remember why, I had a copy of a book by Wilhelm Stekel. And I just started reading it. And it was it's a book of Stekel was a close associate of Freud's who later broke from him. But as I was reading it, it just made perfect sense to me. I didn't find any resistance to the themes of infantile sexuality, the interpretation of dreams. It just seemed to make sense, and it became a world that sort of welcomed me into it. Even when I didn't understand things, I didn't feel like I didn't reject it. I just kept reading, and then going to hear people speak. And there was a whole trajectory of my interest, beginning with an interest in Freud, Erik Erikson, children's drawings. This was something that I was deeply involved in. I was working as a teacher's aide in a classroom when I was about, 19 or 20. And I began looking at the children's drawings, and they made, again, a perfect sense to me. And I had them draw and tell me a story about them. And I wrote the story down. And this became a major avenue into the imaginal life of children and adults, and quite specifically, that both dreams, fantasies, art, symptoms, they speak to us about the social emotional life of the person. And so instead of dealing with the concrete reality of everyday life, of the external reality, there's something about dreams and fantasy and art that gets us to another place. And that just made perfect sense to me. I drew myself as a child, as an adolescent, well into college. I didn't stop my art until I was 35, and it was not a decision to stop. I just noticed that my creative energy started going into more and more into writing. And so the autobiographical component of my interest in psychoanalysis is that I was curious about myself, and psychoanalysis made sense to me until it didn't. And when it didn't, that was when suddenly I was really quite taken by the work of Carl Jung. And so I was still an undergraduate, and I became really, really interested in Jung's work, and again, dreams, fantasies, art. It was all there. And I studied very closely with two Jungians who were very close associates of Carl Jung.
Oh, wow.
One was Joseph Henderson, who wrote one of the chapters in Man and His Symbols.
Oh.
And the other one was John Weir Perry, a very impressive theoretician in the Jungian work. And I spent about 9 years in it. My first article was published. It was in the Jungian kind of tradition. Oh, and by the way, I was doing clinical work from very early on. Even when I was, summer camp when I was in high school, in early college, I was at working with a little girl who was profoundly retarded. Then I started working with very, very disturbed children in a public school, then working with autistic children. I lived in the basement of a residential treatment center for about 14 autistic children. Again, got into Jung, got into my master's program, did all of that, worked with schizophrenics for about 5 years, chronic schizophrenics, and then went back to school for my doctoral work. And I said to myself, I wanted to go there so I could learn Freudian language. And the very first day of orientation, I heard a man, Nathan Adler, and it just shook. He spoke to me. And that was the beginning of my turn. I won't say away from Jung, but I became more of a Freudian at that point. But I never repudiated my time studying Jungian material, never repudiated my teachers or my friends who were Jungians. I chose a different path and became more Freudian from that point forth.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, listener, we're in Daniel's office, which is a delightful space. And as I was thinking, I looked up and over to the left, and I'm looking right at a photograph of Freud with his two children looking right at me. I was like, oh gosh, he's everywhere. And which is why I wanted to do this episode, actually. Like, Freud, he kind of is everywhere. And as you were talking, I was recently reading Stephen Mitchell, who was one of the founders of sort of the contemporary relational psychoanalytic branch of thinking, which is where I spend a lot of time. And in one of his books, he talked about Freud's division internally almost between the scientist of him and the artist, philosopher, literary theorist of him. And that those two elements were both very active inside of him as a person, and therefore are also pretty active in the world of psychoanalysis. As you were talking, it sounds to me like you approached Freud more from that art, philosophy, literary theory kind of direction, and less from the more objectivist, scientific, understanding reality kind of direction. Am I hearing you well there?
It's a nice misunderstanding. Because the truth of the matter is, I think I really do have one foot in each world. I think clinically, your description of where I'm coming from is very much where I'm at clinically. I don't call psychoanalysis, I never use the word science to describe it. I think we can use the scientific method to study aspects of psychoanalysis, whether they're understanding concepts or doing psychotherapy research. But for me, I think of psychoanalysis as a discipline. So that doesn't mean it's not science, but it's not willy-nilly either.
Right.
And the scientific aspect of it, one of the things that's so very, very important to me is that Freud was born in 1856.
Mm-hmm.
1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species. Freud was a Darwinian.
Right.
Darwin said the human organism evolved. Freud said, that makes perfect sense to me. The psyche had to have evolved as well. And so he became very interested in not only the evolution of the psychic structure, but also the way cultural evolution had left its residues in the psyche. He says, what's with this Oedipus complex? How did we get that? How come there are so many universal symbols in the brain? And he says, I want to understand where this stuff came from. Well, there's no sort of time machine, but you can look the artifacts of prehistoric culture. You can look at dreams. You can look at psychoses. You can look at all of these mental states that give us pictures of the structure of the psyche at different stratifications. You can go higher and, be involved in higher math and science and culture, or you can go deeper and deeper and deeper into the imaginal and frankly, the psychotic or visionary, because they live right next to each other. So that part of it is the science part of it. And I would also add, one of the things that I'm interested in is primatology. That if you look at human behavior, people don't like to observe human behavior to abstract our social instincts because we've got all this language that gets in the way. But we share 98.8% of our DNA with chimpanzees, and they don't speak language the way we do. So you can observe them and you can see their innate social instincts of greeting, dominance and submission, alpha male behavior, things of this sort. So I'm speaking to the scientific side.
Right. Yeah.
and looking at how the scientific side is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And eventually it dovetails with metaphor, the imagination, art, religion, all of that.
Yeah. So for a listener who might not be familiar with why Freud is so important, very brief, historical context. Previous to Freud, the application of psychology to try to improve a person's health wasn't really a thing. There were people practicing hypnosis. There was the idea of mesmerism. There were people who were called alienists who would practice. You might have heard of those things or seen them in TV shows that are set before psychologists existed. And they'll be like, well, they're an alienist, not a psychologist. There we go. So don't worry about it. But previous to Freud, there weren't people talking to people about their problems with the goal of trying to treat mental illness. That wasn't really a thing. He was trained as a physician, as a neurologist, I believe, and then started talking to people about their problems and heard about other people who were talking to people about their problems and seeing symptoms that seemed pretty physical, pretty concrete. Not just people were less stressed when they talked to you, but people whose hands were paralyzed all of a sudden could use their hands again after having a conversation with someone else. Real thing that happened. And Freud became interested in that and started to try to develop a way of thinking about it and engaging with it with curiosity and to try to understand what is happening inside of a mind. The listener couldn't see Daniel a minute ago, but literally her hand was going up and down. There's this idea in how Freud thought about the human mind that has this analogy of depth and of archaeology.
Right.
Trying to find what's underneath and what's in the background. And Freud was kind of someone who brought together a lot of things that already were kind of around in the worlds of philosophy and religion and science. And also, he did give us the language that became unified language that's still used throughout not just the totality of psychoanalysis, not just the totality of psychology, but throughout human culture. The English language, and I assume many other languages, are full of words that are commonly used day to day that we use to make sense of our lives that Freud and his colleagues and students introduced. So that's why we talk about Freud, not necessarily because he was there's the debates about the great man theory of history, right? Of human beings are human beings, turns out. And yes, Freud was a genius, clearly. The man did incredible things. And we still talk about him because, in large part, his language and theory that he produced laid the foundation for an entire branch of research, medicine, theory, meaning-making that has rippled throughout the entire human species and how we make sense of one another. Am I overstating it?
No, I don't think so. Not at all. I think one piece of sort of background here is that for thousands of years, and by the way, I'm particularly interested in Freud's, what I call the phylogenetic project of psychoanalysis, which is how did the psyche develop the way it is? And what happened in the last 50 to 100,000 years through our cultural evolution to get to where we are now.
Yeah.
And one of the things that one has to grapple with is that as soon as we had a symbolic function, we were putting words and images on our experience. And that the first theories of psychic function were shamanistic. That the idea there are spirits, okay? And those spirits in time became, organized into religious kinds of solutions. And so until only very recently, 200-300 years ago, any kind of illness a person would have would be attributed to a bad spirit. As soon as the medical model and the scientific method was introduced, all of a sudden people are going, hey, we can eliminate this spirit with a surgery, with a medicine of one sort or another. And they were ticking them off one after another. So they were looking at symptoms. So then Freud comes along and says, well, that's really very cool. But how do we understand what you had just referred to before? How do we understand a psychogenic paralysis or a psychogenic blindness, a blindness or a paralysis that is based not in physiology, but a psychological disturbance.
Right.
And that's where Charcot and Janet had introduced hypnosis, and they were able to remove these kinds of psychogenic problems. Well, that has profound implications. And you say Freud was a genius. I'm very comfortable with that term. But to be specific about that, he had an extraordinary memory and an unbelievable capacity to synthesize lots of material. That's what geniuses do. They have great memories and a magnificent capacity to synthesize material, whether that's a Darwin or an Einstein or a Freud. They can pull it all together. And as you point out, much of what Freud pulled together was things other people had found.
Right.
That's fine. But then the other thing that I think is so important here is that before Freud, the only model we had was a kind of a medical model.
Right.
Either a medical model or a religious or shamanistic model.
Right.
That's what we had. Freud comes along and says, you know what? I'm going to say there's something else going on here. And that is an unconscious motivation. And the way I like to put it, Tyson, is that we have these lenses. Theories are lenses. Okay? There's an unhealthy tradition in our field to say my theory's right and all the other theories are wrong.
Yeah.
It's academically bankrupt idea. It's inappropriate. It's not true. There are different theories. There's a medical model. There's a spiritual or shamanistic model. There's a behavioral model, a cognitive behavioral model, family systems model, a psychoanalytic model. And these are all lenses.
Mm-hmm.
And these lenses enable us to look at the symptomatology or look at the patient
Right.
and see different things. How can you see different things with different lenses? The different lenses ask different questions.
Right.
The shamanistic model is going to ask, oh, what spirit is gotten into you?
Right.
Who put a spell on you?
Mm-hmm.
How are you being tested by the totem or the god?
Right.
Those are the questions that are going to be asked. Medical model. What is the germ? What is the injury that's involved here?
Mm-hmm.
Behavioral. How was this behavior reinforced?
Right.
Cognitive. What's the person thinking about to create this? Psychoanalytic model is going to say, what's the unconscious motivation?
Yeah.
What are the defenses?
Mm-hmm.
How is early childhood experience a kind of a metaphor for ongoing problems throughout the person's life?
Mm-hmm.
So you begin to recognize that you can put on different lenses.
Yeah.
And when you have a patient, you have to ask yourself, which lens am I going to wear?
Yeah. And we swap around with them too.
That's right.
That's kind of an open secret. There's no such thing as intellectual purity. Purity as a category might not exist really in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're all using lots of lenses all the time. I think that's also important because what we end up doing is using the different lenses that we have to sort of construct a multidimensional way of looking at someone, right? You can't look at someone just from one perspective all the time. But that's off topic, perhaps.
But it alludes to the choice of lenses. Why do some people choose humanistic and some people choose Jungian and some people choose Freudian and some people choose cognitive behavioral?
Right.
Well, it has something to do with them.
Yes.
You know, for me, my move to Jung and then later to Freud said something about me and my own development.
Right.
And similarly, people have to look at who are they going to be drawn to?
Yeah.
And the history of psychoanalysis, which is a topic of deep interest to me, is fascinating because throughout the history of psychoanalysis, different people have come up with different ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And those have often been very exciting. But sometimes 3/4 of those new ideas, or maybe more, was restating what Freud said.
Right.
In a new language.
Right. I hear that a lot. I mean, didn't famously Lacan said he never said anything new? He was just repeating what Freud said. Listener, if you're not familiar with the worlds of psychoanalysis, Lacanian analysis feels like one of the most foreign things, to me at least, the most radically different things to listen to people talk about, and to know that the founder of that way of thinking said, actually, I'm just repeating what Freud said, when it feels so drastically different, I think speaks to something of, I don't know, the repetition of it all.
Right.
Which is another theme in Freud.
And, you know, I believe it was Lacan who said, you all are Lacanians, but I'm a Freudian. And Jung is quoted as having saying, thank goodness I'll never be a Jungian. And so you can see that the dangers of some of these categorizations.
Yeah.
And how they become little thought collectives that tend to repeat themselves and miss things. Lacan, as you say, Lacan is often very dense, difficult to get through. But what did he say? He said, language is how we structure our experience.
Right.
I could go for years with that idea. That's just
right. Well, that's the idea that kicked off our conversation in many ways, right? You talk about the symbolic function, which for the listener, that's the ability for a person to use symbols to make sense of their experience. as opposed to being someone who just is experiencing in the moment and reacting in an instinctual way. Symbols allow us to engage differently, to engage with imagination, to be creative, to have memory, these sorts of things. And the language is pretty distilled version of a symbolic function. Words are not an experience, they're a representation of it. And so that's kind of what we're talking about, and how doing that allows people to do incredible things and develop incredible collaboration with one another. We can communicate, we can remember. I mean, your definition of genius is one who can remember and integrate, right? And both of those require the use of the symbolic function.
Right.
And it also has a way of causing trouble because symbols can get messy inside of a mind. A couple thoughts to try to catch up a listener who's maybe less familiar with some of this stuff. Some of the things that Freud is often attributed as being like the person who thought up, although I don't know if he thought it up so much as he sort of coalesced it, are the ideas of thinking about human beings through this primarily developmental mindset of like, we get this way. We are not predestined to become this way. Whatever this way is, our experiences throughout our life inform how we are in the world, right? That's a developmental model, which you'll probably notice in this conversation already, right? And that's coming from Darwin, right? This evolutionary idea applied to society, human culture, and even an individual mind, that the experiences of a person define how they exist and experience the world. That's a thing that is often attributed to Freud. Before that, people weren't really talking about it or thinking about it as much. The other big one is this category of the unconscious, which you'll hear and see everywhere. That's just an assumed that, like, yes, there's so much that happens in a person's mind. And listeners to this podcast will be familiar with our definition of the unconscious and thinking about it. It's a pretty significant thing to acknowledge that, like, before the late 1800s, that wasn't really a category that people used to try to make sense of one another in their lives. So at the very least, those two things pretty radically revolutionize how we go about making sense of one another and ourselves.
Right. And you see, as soon as you say he was formulating the unconscious is sort of an imagined place where there are motivations for our behavior. Many people move through the world thinking, I am me and I decide what I'm going to do. Well, that's fine until suddenly they find themselves saying, well, why do I have this curious fear? Why am I depressed? Why do I have to touch the table 4 times before I leave the house? They begin to get curious about their own behavior because there's something happening outside their consciousness. And that's what Freud's going to say, aha, it's an unconscious motivation.
Yeah.
And then he says, well, gee, if there's an unconscious motivation, and if we bring that into consciousness, there is a kind of a solution. There's a kind of a more comfortable accommodation to the unconscious content. And so in between the unconscious and the conscious are what Freud called the defenses. It's common practice to say to somebody, oh, you're being defensive.
Right. Yeah.
Well, when we say somebody's being defensive, we're saying they're sort of stonewalling us in a certain way. But the fact of the matter is, we all need our defenses in order to be conscious, in order to communicate with other people. But those defenses, each of us has a different constellation of defenses: intellectualization, reaction formation. We had a whole list of different descriptors for the different kinds of ways of managing unconscious contents.
Yeah.
So in between the unconscious and the conscious, maybe even a preconscious, there's a zone of defenses.
Yeah.
And that enables us to be able to get curious. The way I like to put it is, no matter how tall a skyscraper is, it's always sitting on its foundation. No matter how old the person is, The psyche is always built on the foundation of early childhood experience.
Right.
It doesn't define the person forever and always, but the dynamics that are there will probably be there throughout a lifetime. Then Freud says, if we can make the unconscious conscious, there is a kind of a relief. And one of Freud's disciples, students, was Siegfried Bernfeld. Bernfeld formulated this process. He said, the patient comes in and begins to speak in a usual discourse. After a short period of time, they begin to develop a secret. That would be the defensive strategy, the resistance. Then the therapist notices it, helps the patient talk about what's on the other side. The patient makes their confession, or they say what is difficult to say, and then they return to the usual discourse. So it's a process of helping the patient talk about what's difficult to talk about.
Right.
The focus of my work is to say, I want to help the patient talk about what's difficult to talk about so they can live more comfortably in their own skin. And what is it that's difficult to talk about? Well, maybe there are experiences that were very difficult to talk about. Maybe there were confusions that are difficult to talk about. Maybe they don't want to see some of their own impulses, their impulse life. We commonly hear people say, oh, Freud was so old-fashioned, he didn't know what was going on, and I hate Freud. But who today doesn't recognize that childhood has a lot to do with how the adult personality gets organized?
Right.
People understand that childhood trauma will affect the adult personality. That's Freud's ideas. That's his idea. He came up with that.
Right.
And that's sort of a kind of bedrock to our day-to-day life now.
Yeah. Listener, as you're hearing us talk about Freud's theories, you might start imagining a kind of structure in your mind, and that's correct. Freud's theory is sometimes referred to as a structural theory. That idea of like a geography or an architecture of a mind is very much how Freud talked about and how the theory gets played out. I work with a lot of adolescents, and when I talk to people about defenses, I'll say, there's an old saying in adolescent therapy where when you're working with an adult, you try to help them get through their defenses to see what's on the other side. When you're working with an adolescent, you try to get them to build the healthiest defenses you can. The reason for that being that a lot of those things that are on the other side of that defensive space, that defensive zone or wall or barrier, that unconscious stuff, a lot of it is quite distressing to the point of being unbearable. Annihilating is a word that you'll hear used in psychoanalytic spaces. Raw experience of our own selves, of our own impulses, our own desires, of the world around us. A big part of what the unconscious mind does is filter information. If you've ever practiced a kind of meditation where you try to close your eyes and just notice everything you can hear, you realize how much your brain cuts out. It's not just external stimuli that our brain cuts out so that we can focus on what's important. Your brain cuts out the background noise of the road outside of your house so that you can listen to your dad telling you a story. Without that function, you wouldn't hear the story, and the story's important. Similar things happen internally. That's what defenses do. They're erected to try to, on some level, make sure that the important stuff makes it into the unconscious, and the less important or too distressing or too overwhelming stuff stays out of awareness. That's kind of how I've been thinking and talking to people about it. Is that Freudian?
Oh, absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely. And I like the way you describe helping the adolescent patient to build a more flexible set of defensive strategies that allow them in my language, to live more comfortably in their own skin.
Right.
A lot of adolescents feel they've been given information that tells them if they have sexual feelings, there's something bad about that. If they have aggressive feelings, there's something wrong with that. They don't feel that they can touch their own body at night. And to discover themselves, to discover their body, to discover their emotions, their feelings, their sexual feelings, and to be able to make a distinction between the thought and the feeling and the action.
Right.
This is where the adolescent in particular, or anybody that has difficulty acting out, is challenged to recognize that you can have erotic fantasies, you can have violent, hostile, terrible fantasies, and if you can contain them and understand them and say, oh yeah, I must be angry with somebody, okay, or I must be interested in somebody, okay, but then what are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
Then you come into the social realm and you say, okay, what am I going to do with these thoughts and feelings?
Yeah.
That's a whole other question. I had mentioned Bernfeld earlier. Siegfried Bernfeld, who was a student of Freud, Bernfeld's student in San Francisco was Nathan Adler. Nathan was my teacher.
Oh, wow.
So I have that lineage. And Nathan would say, in therapy, you can say anything and do nothing. You see, there's no acting out.
Right.
So the patient falls in love with the therapist. The patient is angry with the therapist. The patient wants to insult the therapist. Fine. You can talk about it. We're just not going to do anything about it. You see.
And that sounds like, in reference to previously in our conversation, keeping the work of the therapy in the symbolic space.
Exactly.
That's the space we're in, so we're going to stay there. Because when we add acting to it, when we add experiencing to it, when we add sort of flesh and blood to it, it gets more complicated, and we move outside of the realm that we're trying to stay in. We're trying to stay in this symbolic place, because that's where we think the problem is.
And, sometimes people feel like, ooh, the unconscious, that's kind of a mysterious thing. It's a mystical thing. I think it's really useful to be able to point rather directly to the unconscious. For me, the easiest way is to recognize that most people have a certain style in dealing with authority figures. They might kiss up to them. They might struggle with them. They might rebel against them. They might try to appeal to them. Whatever that style is, it will frequently move from one authority figure to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. That has roots in early childhood experience.
Right.
Other people, they say, gee, I keep getting involved with women and having these kinds of dynamics. Gee, why is it that all the men I get involved with have these similar characteristics? That's when you're talking about the unconscious and what Freud called the repetition compulsion. The way an early childhood trauma gets organized around a particular dynamic and then gets recreated unconsciously,
right,
but reliably.
Yeah, there was a thread that you dropped a minute ago that I want to make sure to come back to, which is like, chances are, listener, if you're familiar with the name Sigmund Freud, you've almost certainly heard the phrase Freudian psychoanalysis, which is largely discredited or largely debunked. That phrase, largely discredited or largely debunked, shows up after the word Freud so often on the internet, in conversations, on Wikipedia. And if you're hearing some of the theories and things we're talking about and how universal these ideas are, all of a sudden there might be some tension here. Wait a minute. Nobody really disagrees that, yes, there's an unconscious to a person's mind. Nobody really seems to disagree that early childhood experiences seem to have pretty heavy influence over how someone lives their life. Why do people say that phrase, largely debunked, when talking about Freud?
I would say that when Freud brought out his theories, he said an adult person's sexuality did not develop when they were an adult.
Mm-hmm.
It developed over time. And that we all come into the world as a bundle of impulses, erotic and aggressive impulses. And when Freud talked that way, people said, "Oh my God, you're telling me my innocent little children have sexual impulses." And Freud saying, "Yeah." And people said, "Oh, this is terrible. That's a horrible thing to say." And then other people say, Freud didn't discover anything that all the nannies in history already knew.
Right.
So what Freud did was he wrote about it.
Right.
But the nannies already knew about it. But this was and continues to be quite challenging.
Yeah.
And particularly when it comes to erotic feelings or aggressive feelings that emerge in the context of a family. Some people say, "Oh, I don't want to say that I'm angry with my father or that I sometimes hate him. Oh, I can't say that." And you can say, "Well, why not?" Oh, because it's not nice and I love my father. To which I say, this was another thing that Freud said. All relationships contain ambivalence, feelings that go in two or more directions.
Right.
And so for me, a relationship is not seen as, a beautiful image of a peaceful, happy family. No, it's more of a collage. And it's got beautiful things and happy memories, but it's also got hurts and bitter stories and arguments and fights and wonderful adventures and funny things that were said. A relationship is a collage. And in therapy, we invite the patient to talk about the whole collage, recognizing that if they say something negative about their parent, it will not fall apart. It doesn't mean they don't love their parent.
Right.
Other people, they say, "Oh, I hate my father and I can't possibly tolerate thinking that he did anything good."
Yeah.
Or that, "Oh, my mother, oh boy, I will never let her." And then you say, well, except for this was nice. And all of a sudden, guess what happens? You get more of a complete picture. You accept yourself more. Comes back to, again, living more comfortably in your own skin.
Right.
So when people say, Freud and his discredited theory, number one, his theories have received backlash and misunderstanding from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Does Freud or do Freudian or psychoanalytic organizations have anything to do with some of the misunderstandings? I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
But if you can get into it without feeling like you have to have an argument with him,
Right.
you can say, let's see if I can understand what he's saying. There was a professor at Berkeley I remember hearing about. He was talking about Freud, and the students were arguing and saying, "This is nonsense. It's sexist. It's misogynistic. It's all this." And he said, in this class, we're not here to critique Freud. We're here to learn what Freud said. As soon as you learn what Freud said, if you want to get a good critique of Freud, look at the Freudian literature. Look at psychoanalytic history.
Yeah.
It is filled with the critiques of Steckel and Jung and Adler and Ronk and Melanie Klein and Ferenczi and Ernest Jones and Lacan. And the critiques are within psychoanalysis. So when the reader gets curious, I always say to my patients, they say, "Well, I don't know about this therapy because I'm kind of skeptical." I say, "Welcome."
Yeah.
I say, the two things you need to be a patient in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, there's curiosity and skepticism. If you're just curious, you're going to accept everything I say, and then it's not going to be very helpful.
Right.
If you're just skeptical, we're not going to get started. But if you're curious and then skeptical, that means you're not going to believe anything that I say, I hope.
Right.
Only believe it if it makes sense to you.
Mm-hmm.
You see? If it fits you.
Yeah, I'm brimming with free association, so I'm going to try to not go all over the place. I have a good friend who's a writer. He's a novelist. His first book was published this year. Nate Knapp's Daybook. Go buy it online, listener. He and I were talking a few years back about similarities in our fields. And what we decided at the time on his back porch at, 3 a.m. full of nicotine and alcohol was that the thing that made our jobs the same was that both required the practitioner of either writing or psychotherapy to be self-aware and unflinching, which sound a lot to me like your categories of curiosity and skepticism.
Mm-hmm.
That self-awareness comes from a kind of curiosity of the self. And to be unflinching is another way of saying, I'm going to accept what's in front of me, even if it's in tension or conflict with what I want to believe about the world. I was talking with Rachel Newcomb. We were talking about what it's like to supervise people. And what she was saying is that the goal when teaching and supervising is to help people to develop capacity for critical thinking. And part of what I'm hearing you say is, if we approach Freud with the intention to use him as a way to increase our capacity for critical thinking, if we approach Freud not as someone who's descending from the mountain with the stone tablets of thou shalt accept that the id exists or whatever, but instead as a partner in dialogue who's offering tools and lenses with which we can try to engage more deeply with ourselves and one another, there's a lot that can be got from that. Thinking about this impulse to reject Freud, I've heard people say at times that Freud had this obsession with sex and aggression because of his particular cultural location, that at the time that he came up, people didn't talk about sex and aggression, but now we do, and that's why he seems so hyperfixated on it. And I don't know if that's true. I think maybe human beings really don't like talking about sex and aggression. And in one of the major critiques that I see of the relational analytic tradition I'm a part of, it seems like we've kind of taken out the sex and aggression sometimes in ways that leave us with blind spots because it's so uncomfortable to talk about. There's two sort of experiences in my mind about the rejection of Freud. The first was the first time that I went home from college and visited my parents' church, this conservative evangelical church. And there was someone who said, "Oh, what are you studying off at that university of yours?" And I was like, I'm studying sociology. And they said, "Okay, well, be careful. Don't read too much of that Marx and Freud and all those other atheists," right? And then, ironically, my degree in sociology, read a lot of Marx. And my degree in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, read a lot of Freud. So here I am. Didn't listen to that guy. So there's the one side of the rejection, right? Those intellectual atheists, we don't like them. And then I'm listening to a podcast right now called I Hate James Dobson. And James Dobson is this figure from evangelical child rearing. He's written a lot of books and sort of created this mode of authoritarian parenting that's done a lot of harm. And so there are these therapists who are doing a podcast, reading the books and critiquing them. And the main host of the show is a gay man who's a sex therapist and is very critical of his conservative evangelical upbringing. And the word Freudian has come up on this show a few times, and every time it's derogatory. So you've got the more conservative side saying, well, we don't like that guy. You've got the more progressive side saying, well, we don't like that guy. And I find myself wondering, gosh, why do we dislike him so much? Is it because of what he said? Is it because of how he's been used? What's the deal?
I think his ideas are challenging. Yeah. And as you say, you have to have a certain amount of either curiosity or courage to face some of these things. And Tyson, when you began, you asked me about the autobiographical nature of my interest in psychoanalysis. That's something I could go on and on for hours about. But I want to mention that there are autobiographical components, Freud's autobiographical components in psychoanalysis.
Right.
He discovered his own Oedipus complex. He discovered his own sibling rivalry. And those became very, very important points of orientation in his theory. And he said, this is what it is. And Otto Rank said, oh, my good professor, that's very interesting what you say about the Oedipus complex. I see your point. But you know what? There's something else about the mother. And Freud said, no, you're off base. And Otto Rank said, no. I think I really am onto something here. There is a birth anxiety, not just castration anxiety. Freud was very upset with that. But then he said, you know what, Otto, you're right. But you know what? There is a birth anxiety, and then there's two other anxieties, and then the castration anxiety. So his theory opened up. Why is it that Otto Rank was able to move away from the Oedipus and go to the mother? It's his own personal story.
Right.
He had a terrible relationship with his father, was very close to his mother. But guess what? He was doing that while a lot of other analysts were saying, Freud keeps talking about the father, and we keep hearing about the mother. And guess what? Melanie Klein, Sandor Ferenczi, they had bigger mother issues. So, and sometimes people say, oh, this is crazy. What kind of a theory is this? People take their own madness and they turn it into a theory. What I would say is, if you know a little bit about yourself, you know that.
Right.
If you know yourself to great depths, you know something about all people. And you see, that's what happened. And you look at the biggest contributions of the biggest analysts throughout psychoanalytic history, they discovered something about themselves and they brought it to psychoanalysis. Andre Green, he brought this concept of the dead mother, the unresponsive mother. Major contribution. It's his own story, and he tells you in the interview, he tells you that was what I struggled with. Erik Erikson, he never knew his father. His father was Danish. Mother was Jewish. He was raised by his stepfather, Dr. Hamburger. He becomes the tall, blonde, blue-eyed Jew at the temple. And so they don't accept him at the temple. They don't accept him at school because he's Jewish. He's not accepted here or there. He becomes an artist. He goes to Anna Freud. He works in her school. He becomes a psychoanalyst without ever going to the university. He marries a Canadian. He comes to the United States at the time of the rise of Hitler. He's the one that gives us the concept of the identity crisis.
Yeah.
You see, he knows about it.
Part of what I'm hearing is that the critiques of any theory speak to the limitations of the person who was able to access what they could access of their own self to make the theory. And being humans, we are all limited. And those limitations come out in our theory. I feel like Freudian theory in particular gets a lot of critique around the sexuality, both from this repressed kind of you don't have sexuality until you're married attitude that you can get in certain cultures.
And then good luck.
Right. Gosh, yes. Yeah, well, keeping us in business. But then on the other side of it, you can get a lot of critiques of Freud of, Freud talked about sexuality wrong. And I wonder, can you speak to someone who might be coming with that in mind of like, I don't like the way he talks about sexuality. It feels so regressive.
Whenever I teach, I always tell my students, my middle name is metaphor. Metaphor is the key to all of this.
Yeah.
Some of the biggest problems people have with Freudian theory is that he speaks sometimes in an incredibly concrete fashion.
Yes.
He speaks about symbolism in dream. He talks about the transference of an object relation onto the analyst. He talks about the symptom of being a condensation and a displacement. We have that in the dream work as well. But then he begins to talk about things like castration anxiety and penis envy. And everybody, they slam on the brakes. The whole thing looks crazy. It doesn't work. But you mentioned Lacan earlier. Lacan will say, in the French psychoanalytic school, will say, the penis is an organ. The phallus is social power. We have throughout cultural evolution tended to associate the penis or the scepter or the sword or the tower or the monolith or the obelisk with power, social power. If you reinterpret penis envy and castration anxiety as the anxiety of losing social power and the envy of social power, the whole thing makes a lot more sense. The other thing is, you need to be able to recognize that Freud said that the psyche is bisexual. He didn't say people are behaviorally bisexual. He said the psyche is bisexual. That allows a woman to not only have envy of social power, but also feel the threat of castration, of losing her social power. That enables a man to have envy of social power and fear the loss of social power. There are some people who are so anxious to let everybody know how much power they have, how big their car is, how many towers they have.
How large their hands are.
How large their hands are. Okay, we're going to get into it. This is penis envy, you see. But you got to put that key in the door to open it up. And the key is metaphor.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm thinking about one of the first times that I really sat down post-grad school to read some Freud. I was working with a supervisor. He gave me a flash drive that was full of the entire collected works of Freud and Jung. And he was like, here, start reading this, and then we'll talk about it. And then sent me out into the world. So I'm sitting at a Starbucks at Green Lake, and I'm like, okay, let's read some on the interpretation of dreams. Why not? Let's get started. And I'm reading through this, and I get to the sexuality piece. And it is concrete. And I find myself wrestling with being like, oh, this feels weird. What's happening? But I'm trained in attachment theory. And I've thought about attachment a lot. And I'm realizing, what Freud's saying here, I would just say very similar things, just use the language of attachment theory. And I'm like, cool, I'm going to talk to my supervisor about this. So I go to my supervisor's office and I sit down and I'm like, hey, I read some of the books you gave me. By some of the books he gave me, I mean, I read like a few pages of a PDF, but whatever. He didn't need to know that. Or maybe he did. And I share my little insight. And his response was, well, keep reading. He seemed a little bit off-put and wanted me to keep reading. And the vibe that I got from him was, well, that's cute, but eventually you'll understand how right Freud was. And that felt so deflating. I didn't open any more of those PDFs. That to me sounds like someone's use of their theory, someone's use of Freud as the monolithic genius who tells you what's true in a very concrete way. And I wonder if some of that history is also part of the resistance that people have to Freud, is the way that this theory that is can be very concrete in its language and very sort of provocative in ways that can feel a little icky, if some of people's rejection of it is some rejection of the way that that theory can be used to provide that response of like, well, that's cute, but like accept the truth that we're telling you that feels icky and just deal with it.
I think that when you read Freud and you hear attachment theory, I think that's absolutely beautiful. Someone else can read Freud and see language.
Right.
And someone else can read Freud and is going to look at object relations or symbolism. you've got to bring yourself to it.
Mm-hmm.
Freud would talk about the oral stage, and it was a very intrapsychic viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
He said the infant is sucking at the nipple and taking in the mother. Okay, it's not just taking in the milk, it's taking in the experience of mother.
Mm-hmm.
And Winnicott says that there's no such thing as a baby
Right.
without a mother. And Erickson says, well, that's fine for the oral stage, but psychosocially,
Mm-hmm.
this is about trust versus mistrust. And you go, oh, no, well, which one is it? It's not which one is it. Again, it comes back to lenses.
Yeah.
How are we going to look at the same thing
Mm-hmm.
and see it from another angle to bring object relations? That's wonderful.
Right.
To bring another viewpoint to it, it elaborates it. It doesn't negate it.
Right.
Often people will say, no, that's wrong because family systems theory shows X, Y, and Z. Family systems theory is magnificent. It doesn't negate what you see behaviorally, medical model viewpoint. It doesn't negate it. Now, there are some theories will have aspects that will negate each other.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
But the other thing that was so striking was that Freud was hearing people's dreams, and things were often rather explicit. He didn't have a lot of psychotic patients, but psychotic patients give us the material in a very concrete fashion.
Yeah.
His office, you may have seen pictures of his office. He had over 1,500 antiquities. That was not just a little pastime.
Mm-hmm.
That was part of his psychoanalytic project. He was saying, you know what? We are dealing with sex and aggression. We are dealing with death and love. And here is my Egyptian death mask. And here is a figure of Athena, the goddess. And here are these little antiquities over here. And all of these things are concretizations of this evolving psychology. It's just absolutely a brilliant, some people call it his hobby. It was not his hobby. I maintain it was not his hobby at all.
Yeah.
It was a passion.
Yeah.
I have my own collection right here.
Yeah. I've been looking at it as you're talking. Like, oh, I see where the influence is.
But you know, Freud was interested in all of the mythology within history, Greek, Roman, Egyptian. But when he wrote about the evolution of consciousness, his focus was on prehistory, about which we knew very, very little.
Yeah.
And my contribution has been to address that. That's why I've got my Paleolithic stone tools here,
Right.
Neolithic clay pots here in my office. But Freud was saying these things, before they become symbolic, are often very concrete. You look at god-awful, terrible crimes. They are the concretization of psychology.
Yeah.
You look at psychotic patients' preoccupations. They are the concretization of some of these sorts of things.
Yeah. The thing that I'm hearing that feels really relevant to this show and what I'm trying to do with it is that the things that we want to culturally or just personally reject about Freud as a person, Freudian theory, are often not meant to be places to stop. They're meant to be a way in, not to be too corny about it, but we bring into Freudian theory whatever we already carry with us. So I brought attachment theory in. Other people bring, feminist critique. Like there's a lot of like multicultural critique of theory, right? As you're talking about Freud's interest in myth and history, the thought going through my mind was, well, that which he had access to. Right. Which was largely, Mesopotamian. Even the Germanic myth and history was less like culturally present, even though he was in that region, right? Like that would be a post-colonial critique, a post-colonial lens that's brought. Before we started recording, I quoted a little bit of scripture, because that's a lens that I can't avoid no matter what, I guess. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. It's through our tools of meaning-making coming into contact and creating friction and heat and sparks, and sometimes even a little bit of discomfort, that those tools become more effective and useful. And it's through our discomfort that we develop our sharpness and our efficacy.
I got a chance to study with, as I mentioned before, two students of Jung's. One student of Alfred Adler, and that was Rollo May, who was a rather significant figure in his own right. The other one was Nathan Adler, who was a student of Siegfried Bernfeld, a student of Freud. So I had a very rich experience studying in San Francisco. It's got a very vibrant psychoanalytic tradition there.
Yeah.
And in 1999, I moved to Caracas, Venezuela.
Right.
And I lived there for 11 years. And I taught at the Universidad Central de Venezuela and at Universidad Carlos Andrés Bello. And the students would always have this attitude like, oh, wow, you're from San Francisco. And, you know, everything was happening in San Francisco or New York or London or Vienna. And I'd say, I'm in Venezuela now. Mm-hmm. So it's happening here for me now. Mm-hmm. So I want to invite you to be here now and discover psychoanalysis through your tropical Caraqueño lens, you see, to be able to see what you can see here. Well, I was only there for 9 months when we had a massive flood that killed thousands and thousands of people.
Wow.
Well, for the next 11 years that I was there, both the programs at the two universities I was at got themselves organized around emergencies and acute stress disorders and post-traumatic stress disorders. And all of a sudden, you begin to discover things. 1918, the First World War is over. Freud had students on both sides of the First World War. They came to Budapest to talk about war neuroses. They had worked with soldiers who were suffering from war neuroses. These are the first traumatic stress disorders.
Yeah.
But while they were in the middle of the war, they had their eyes open.
Yeah.
Their psychoanalytic eyes were open. Similarly, if you end up working with mentally retarded patients, open your psychoanalytic eyes. You work with autistic, open your psychoanalytic eyes. You're working in community mental health, open your psychoanalytic eyes.
Yeah.
Art, theater, dance, it's a lens to see the world. It's not a matter of whether it's right or it's wrong. It's a tool. It's a tool, and you can use it. You can use it. Make it your own, you see. One other thing I want to mention with regard to Freud being a genius, what I would say is that what Freud did was he looked at things that people had been looking at for thousands of years and saw things that no one had ever seen before. Then he gave us those lenses so that now we can go look at things and say, let me see if I can see something that no one's ever seen before or that I have never seen before. Let me go to the park and watch the children at play. Let me go to the opera and see the people in the break. What's happening? What's happening in the world? Or let me look at the political situation. Let me look at it through my psychoanalytic lenses. Let me see something. Let me look at something that's been looked at many times before and that no one's ever seen. You mentioned the picture over here of Freud with his two grandchildren.
Oh, grandchildren.
Yeah. And the one on the right is Ernst. And Freud was visiting that little boy when he's about 9 in that picture. But when he was about 1.5 years, Freud was visiting little Ernst, and he was playing with a spool, a wooden spool attached to a string. And he would throw it away and he'd say, gone. And then he'd pull it back and he'd say, There it is. And then he'd throw it away. Gone. Then he'd pull it back. There it is. Well, guess what? Children at that age do that all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
Every religion, every race, they throw little things away. And Freud was looking at that, and he said, he's trying to come to terms with the comings and goings, the absence and presence of his mother, and finding a way for him to be present in the absence of his mother. Mm-hmm. It was perhaps the most discussed observation of everything Freud wrote about. And you just look at how he was able to look at this little scene and see something no one else had ever seen.
Yeah.
That little boy was a friend of mine when he was an old man. And he's the one that I wrote the book about, this, The Interwoven Lives of Sigmund Anna and W. Ernest Freud. So,
yeah, there's something about the proximity of it. Time is very relevant to all of this, that we're looking at time as both distant and also immediate. And I find talking about Freud and early analysts especially disorienting to me because it's so easy to think of them like mythological religious figures. But then when you know someone who hung out, when you're having a conversation with someone, when I'm having a conversation with someone who hung out with the kid's grandson, it's like, wait a minute, hang on. This is both close and far. And those two things are not in so much conflict as they might seem. Thank you so much for your time. Listener, in the show notes, which on your app that you're listening to this on or whatever website, you'll be able to find, most likely by swiping to the left, you'll find links to Daniel's books that he's referenced, as well as a few other books he's recommended. I'll try to find that photo that I can link to, as well as if you're especially interested in this conversation around the political dimension and that cross-cultural dimension. Daniel did a really interesting interview on another podcast that's put on by, are they a journal, a magazine? Room? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll link to that as well, because I think that's an interesting conversation. And if you like this one, you should check that out. But with that, thank you so much for your time. I feel like we could talk about this stuff for years and might. So thank you for coming on the show.
Very good. It's been a pleasure, Tyson. Thank you so much.
Special thanks to Dr. Daniel Benveniste. When I reached out to Daniel asking if he had any last-minute updates or something to plug, he sent me something to read, which is this. I hope my podcast presentation on the legacy of Sigmund Freud will inspire others to rediscover psychoanalysis anew and contribute to its ongoing development. Thank you, Daniel. Speaking for myself, I'll say I also hope that. Daniel didn't mention this in his email to me, but listener, if you are in the greater Seattle area sometime between October 17th and 20th, the International Forum for Psychoanalytic Education will be held in that city on those days. Both Daniel and I are presenting at that conference. So if you liked this conversation and wanted to hear more from either of us, well, if you want to hear more from me, just don't unsubscribe from the podcast feed. But if you wanted to hear more from Daniel and you'll be around in a couple weeks, you'll be able to hear from him then. The next podcast episode is my interview with Carol Poole on the topic of using psychoanalysis to navigate times of crisis. That episode will release in 2 weeks. This has been The Way In. This show is hosted and produced by me, Tyson Connor, with music by Ben Lewis and visual art by Dan Lane. If you enjoyed this show, please rate, review, subscribe, follow, like, share, star, heart, reblog, retweet, repost, upvote, or in some meaningful way engage with the episode on your digital platform of choice. I'm told it makes a big difference for exposing more people to the show. And if you think someone you know may like this episode, you could also just tell them about it. You can follow the show on social media, where we are at The Way In Pod. There you can give me feedback, tell me a joke, and see high-resolution versions of the individual episode art, which I highly recommend. I think Dan did a great job. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.